All right, welcome everyone. We are in the nice right after lunch spot, so we promise we'll keep this panel super exciting so we keep everyone on the edge of their seat. For those of you who I didn't meet yesterday, I'm Cassie Lancelotti-Young. I'm the EVP of Customer Success at SailThrough. We talked a lot yesterday and earlier this morning around how a key theme of the conference this year is retention. And I'm personally really excited about the panel that we have in front of us today. We're going to be talking about personalization strategies, the bread and butter of what SailThrough is all about, and how they can really help to drive and optimize retention strategies. So with that, I'm going to ask my fellow panelists to go ahead and quickly introduce themselves and tell us which companies you're with, what you do, what your role looks like, and then we'll dive into some of the content from there. Let's start with you, Keith. Keith missed the memo that we were all going to wear black here, so we're going to go and we'll kick it off with him.
I should probably be sitting in the middle or something to kind of break up the colors. I'm Keith Ferry. I am the Senior VP of Digital at the Blaze. You ask, what's my primary role? I think it kind of spans a number of different things, but as it relates to email, I oversee the partnership with SailThrough and work with our email newsletter teams to optimize the use of the platform. So I think as it relates to this particular panel, that is my predominant role for that.
Great, and I'm Shar Van Boskirk. I think you guys got a bit of an intro to my story this morning. I'm an analyst at Forrester Research, and I study digital marketing. So I spend a lot of time thinking about email specifically, but also studying how digital marketing tools can help you create better, more relevant relationships with your customers and help you acquire good customers that will become more valuable to you over time.
Hi, I'm Tracy Inglis, so I'm the SVP of Marketing at JustFab. We have 4 brands, Fabletics, which is Kate Hudson's brand, if you've heard of that, JustFab, Shoedazzle, and Fab Kids. And so I'm responsible for email marketing for JustFab and Shoedazzle at JustFab.
Great, thanks guys. Well, let's dig right in. So the panel is called Personalization Strategies to Drive Retention, but I think one of the things we've heard in a couple of the sessions today is that personalization can mean very different things to different people, right? I think Neil Capel said this morning, some people would define it as something as so simple as field insertion, right? Versus on the other end of the spectrum, you have this notion of true one-to-one relevance. Talk to us about what personalization means to each one of you and how you define that, and maybe a little bit about how your perspective has evolved over the course of the past few years. Tracy, you want to kick it off?
Sure. For me, personalization really is defined by the customer. So an example I like to give to people is to think about shopping and what it was like in the 1950s in the US, right? So that's when a shopper would walk into a store and the shopkeeper would say, "Hey, Mrs. Jones, it's so good to see you. I haven't seen you in 2 weeks. Normally you're here every single week. And oh, by the way, how was your birthday? I hope you had fun. And we have a new set of polka dot dresses. I know how much you love them. I want to show them to you," right? So that's personalization in knowing all of those different points. He knew her name, that it was her birthday, that she likes polka dotted dresses, how often she normally shops and when the last time she had been in. That's something that I challenge our team to be able to replicate across millions of customers in that one-to-one type of relationship.
Shar, how about you?
So I think personalization has gone through a bit of a cycle where we started with the idea of the insert name here, the field population definition. And then I think that has gradually given way to segmentation or customization, where you were focused on better creation of relevant content to people who were like other people in a particular group. And I think there was some discussion this morning around modern personalization, and I don't know if there's a specific definition to that, but I think what that says to me is I think we're at a place where we're looking at individualization today, where now it's about tailoring the interaction, the functionality, and the content of an experience to an individual, not just profiling me by my name and not just putting me in a segment of other like customers. So that's how Forrester is thinking about it. And I think that also applies outside of traditional marketing experiences, where you might have experiences that resonate with a customer and represent your brand, but are not necessarily direct marketing communication.
How about you?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I'm glad to hear that Forrester's definition is kind of matched with what we've been trying to accomplish. It tells us that we're onto something. For us as a content company, Our goal is to bring each individual user or reader or however you want to define them, relevant content when they want it and how they want it. The how is a little bit, challenging at the moment, but we, with the help of Sailthrough's platform, collect a lot of data on how you interact with our services, with our products, and then bring the content, the new content, to the user in a really relevant way. So it might be based on, a story, or for us, television content or marketing, but it really is getting down to that individualization. I really like that, because we did in the past, personalize it with buckets of groups of users, and now it's really down to the individual. If you read this many stories on terrorism and this many stories on sports, your experience in our email delivery and soon on our site is going to be vastly different than someone else who doesn't read those kinds of stories and is more entertainment focused. So.
Great, and that's a great segue. One of the other questions I had for you guys was, as you think about what personalization means, how are your specific brands, particularly for JustFab and the Blaze, working toward that? And then Shar, I would love to hear more from your perspective around brands that you look at that you think are doing this really well. I think you touched a little bit on this morning, but would love to hear more. I think you just started to touch upon this from the Blaze perspective, Keith, in terms of technically and organizationally what that looks like.
Yeah.
But talk to us about, maybe where that's come from a year or two ago, or where you guys are going to be going as you continue that effort toward the Forrester definition in 2016.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit just prior to the panel starting, what was the platform that we used prior to Sailthrough. It was more of a utility platform where it was a CPM-driven model, blast everyone the same message. For us, personalization, individualization is driven a lot by the product that we're delivering. So for our content newsletters, personalization, individualization comes in the form of you getting an email that probably is completely unique when stacked up against the million or so other subscribers. It's based on the stories you've already read. It's based on your past reading habits, your interaction with our site. And then, sort of switch gears for us, thinking about it being product driven, we have a direct-to-consumer television network that we have acquisition strategy around, we have retention strategy around, and getting people to tune in or subscribe to a particular program is driven largely by that same user profile. So if we have a great program where Glenn Beck, who is sort of the key personality at the head of our company, is interviewing Ted Cruz, we'll target not 1 million people, but we may target 50,000 people who we know have read 3 or more Ted Cruz articles in the past 3 months, to acquire new subscribers. They may not know that we have a network, or may not know what kind of content we cover. So it really is product driven, but it's the user profile and really tracking what they're doing that allows us to do that personalization.
Sure. And Tracy, you spoke earlier about how you're trying to replicate sort of the boutique shopkeeper type feeling. I think that ties in really nicely with what Neil Capel spoke about this morning with his father as the greengrocer, a very similar approach. How are you guys thinking about getting to that point at JustFab? What are some of the initiatives at play to help support that and make that a reality?
Yeah, I think there's really 3 critical pieces to getting there, and first and foremost is having clean omni-channel data, right? So I can't tell someone happy birthday or say you might like this polka dotted dress if I don't know when their birthday is and that they like polka dotted dresses, right? So that data has to be there, and it has to be omni-channel. There's nothing more annoying than someone chasing you around and saying, hey, buy these red boots when you already bought them, right? So you need to have that integrated. And then the second of the 3, I would say, is a good software service platform to be able to do it. So a partner like Sailthrough can help us to actually serve up those messages at the appropriate times. And then third is really our creative thinking as a team. So I have a great team in place, and we're constantly thinking of, we read in our customer survey comments that people are asking for where their products are on their wait list, right? So maybe we need to make a communication about that, trying to understand what is the consumer mindset and having that right context and communicating that appropriately. So the ideas were always there, and now just having the data and the platform, we're able to start executing on them. It's been really exciting.
That's great. And Shar, you spoke earlier about the Forrester definition of personalization. I think we love hearing that as well too. It's very much where we see the market going. As you study a lot of brands and you look at what's happening in the market, who are some companies that you really admire that you think are working diligently toward really executing on that vision?
So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of companies that I think have extended the idea of where personalization can be applied.
Sure.
So I mentioned that we look at this idea of individualization being applied in three, to customize three different things: functionality, interaction, and content. And I think oftentimes in a marketing example, you can see where a personalization capability has been applied to content or to offers. But the two examples that come to mind that I think are very compelling here, one is from Wells Fargo, where Wells Fargo is actually personalizing its ATM screens based on the kinds of interactions that you tend to have with the ATM, and also based on the profile data that they have about you and the account information that they have about you. So imagine that your experience, literally the buttons that show up on the ATM machine, vary based on the kind of activity that you tend to need to do at the ATM. So that's interesting. It's a very personalized experience, and they're starting to look at some of the emotional things, like you mentioned the happy birthday, to also just make it feel like it's a more, a more personal thing, something that's more connected emotionally. And then the second example brings in another dimension, which is this notion of proactive or even a predictable dimension to personalization. And this example comes from the Weather Channel, where they now actually have a feature in one of their apps where runners can provide information about their running profile, the data that integrates with like a Fitbit or another fitness tracker, that then the Weather Channel maps to what it knows about weather and predicts things like, hey Shar, for you, your best run is gonna be Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock in this location around Boston. That's a very individualized experience, and it's a very proactive way of the Weather Channel improving the relevancy and sort of extending into the pieces that are important to me specifically. Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that Citibank steals a page out of the Wells Fargo playbook, because that would be great. So Keith, in dealing with the Blaze, I think you guys have a pretty large team that's working across your various brands. I think they're really well unified in a lot of these efforts around personalization. Are you willing to share with us who really owns personalization for the Blaze? I think that's one of the things we see across our client base, is that it can vary materially from customer to customer. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on who owns it now. Has that changed? How are you thinking about it for moving forward?
Yeah, it's definitely changed. I mean, we launched on the platform 2 Januaries ago, so January 2014. And I think when we launched, we were trying to wrap our heads around what does it actually mean to personalize, how do we leverage the internal assets, and then also how do we work with the sale-through team to learn what's available, what's not available, and how to best utilize the tools that are there. So we had probably a very collaborative, sort of cross-functional ownership structure where each individual newsletter manager would own personalization decisions and strategy within their newsletters. So for example, our Blaze Firewire newsletter is 100% automated and personalized. And that happened sometime last year, but that decision was made with the team on the Firewire side. Our Glenn Beck newsletter is still completely manual and not automated at this point. So we left that sort of individually in the hands of the owners. But what we've done recently is, and he's actually sitting out here in the audience right now. Chris, you want to raise your hand? I told you I'd do that to you. Yeah, right there. So we hired Chris back actually just recently, and Chris is tasked with optimization and personalization and basically utilization of the sale-through tools and other things as well. But he is now the owner of all things personalization optimization. So we think it may be a better approach to have that rest with one person who then coordinates very closely with each individual newsletter management team, because as probably most content companies know, a newsletter manager does not like to be told how to run their newsletter because they do know best. But Chris will be the one to suggest new ways to utilize tools in sale-through and some of the data that we have and how to better optimize that. So we've migrated from sort of a cross-functional team approach to it sits with him and working very closely where it's still cross-functional, but ultimately the decisions will come out of that one point. Mm-hmm.
Well, Chris, I suspect you're going to make a lot of friends at the cocktail hour later because everyone's going to want to learn a little bit more about this. But Shar, going back to companies like Wells Fargo or like the Weather Company, as you look at those, are there any themes that you're seeing at some of these larger enterprises as well too in terms of where personalization sits in the organization so far as who owns it?
So I don't know that there's a standard best practice. I think that's the tricky thing with organizational decisions, is that it depends often on personality dynamics so much. But I think the key that is true about both of those examples is that the data, the customer insights function, is very closely tied to the customer experience and the marketing function. And I think Tracy made this point very well, that you can't expect to do personalization well if you don't actually have data, or if the data you have is not being leveraged in a way that you can take action on it. So however they have set up their organization, and in both of those cases, their customer experience teams run the personalization efforts. But I've seen it work very well where marketing runs it too, and in all cases, then the CI function, the insights team, has a very close relationship and is sort of responsible for the data engine that is creating the effects of the personalization.
Sure, interesting. Yeah, I think we see something pretty similar to that as we look across the customer base in terms of where it lives. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So, Tracy and Keith in particular, your guys' teams are really trailblazers when it comes to pushing that personalization agenda forward. I think sometimes one of the more painful things that we see sitting in our seat as we talk to a lot of people in the market is that even though there's a strong appetite for personalization, a lot of times the adoption of personalization lags. Curious to get your perspectives on what are the barriers to play there? Why are companies slower to adopt even though we know what the returns could look like? I'd love to hear it just from a client perspective, and then Shar, I'm sure you have some interesting anecdotes to share from some of your research as well. You want to go ahead,
Sure.
Tracy? Yep.
Yeah, so barriers, I think, it's not easy, right? It's somewhat easy to come up with the ideas of how you would execute and what you want to do, but then you have to actually work cross-functionally to pull together a team to get the data together, to get the software together, and to execute on those ideas, not just in email, but on site, in direct mail, on your app, and your text messages. So it requires a lot of collaboration. It requires a lot of clean data. Not everyone has omni-channel data. That's a challenge right there. Not everyone has the right fields calculated. We spent the last, say, year or so working with our developers to come up with specific variables so that we can track on an individual basis what someone's shopping patterns are. So if I shop every single week and I haven't shopped in 3 weeks, I'm just as lapsed as someone who shops once a month and hasn't shopped in 3 months, right? So defining things like that really takes some time and take a lot of cross-functional effort, but it's definitely worth it. I can testify. We've seen significant lifts in sales from being able to apply these things.
How about you, Keith?
Yeah, I think our experience was very similar just on the content side. But I think one of the big barriers is, when you first start thinking about personalization and customization, the numbers, when you're talking with a team, when you say, can we blast 1 million people the same message, or should we blast 50,000 people a customized message? Most people are going to default to well, why wouldn't we blast 1 million people? All we need at that point is a 2% open rate or a 20% open rate, a 2% conversion rate, and we're going to outpace the 50,000. Well, that's true for the one blast, but if you do that 10 times a month, you're going to start to see people unsubscribing, you're going to see spam reports, or just fatigue generally, right? So I think a big barrier for us was just to acknowledge that the numbers game is just sort of throw that out, right? It doesn't, a bigger number isn't always better. But then for us, the way to overcome that was working. This isn't a sales pitch for Sale-Through, certainly sound like one. But we knew we weren't.
You're in a safe zone here. It's mostly customers.
Okay. You want me to speak slowly so they can hear it very clearly? No, but we had to admit that we were not email experts, right? We had to say, we're getting better at this, but we needed to work with the team at Sale-Through to say, what is a good open rate, consistently over a 60-day period for marketing messages? What's a benchmark metric that we should be paying attention to when we customize and personalize and send to a smaller number. So then our team can then look at those blasts and those campaigns and evaluate them across the right metric, as compared to looking at and saying, well, the open rate was a little bit higher, but it only was seen by 5,000 people. Well, that might actually be pretty good if you only sent to 10,000 people and you've got 50% engagement. So I think there was a big obstacle in just sort of wrapping your head around a bigger number isn't always better, and targeting over a longer period of time keeps for us, your engagement levels higher, your retention levels higher, and fatigue goes down in a very significant way.
Mm-hmm. And Shar, what are you seeing?
Well, so one of the things that I was thinking this morning when you guys were showing some of your new features and capabilities is that I think for emailers, it has been very difficult to apply advanced analytics and personalization and still keep the cost low. So in a direct mail context, it was easy to make the case to apply analytics because the smarter you were about targeting, the less money it cost. Mm-hmm. You could spend money on analytics because then you were sending less mail and it was costing you less. But to your point, in an email context, it often costs you more to figure out how to send smarter email than to just send out a bunch of emails. And so I think that's one of the hesitations, is that until marketers can feel like they have reasonably cost-effective tools to help them do personalization, they want to be able to do that personalization in a way that costs them less than just sending out the bad email. And I think that's where the hesitation comes in.
That's interesting. We talked a little bit yesterday around sort of the trade-offs between the acquisition and retention side, and how so many of the tools that are out there in the market have been very focused on acquisition, right? And I think that even goes back to the direct mail days and the optimization tactics that are there, but fewer have been there to help with the retention side of the equation. So that's interesting. It's a good segue into, wouldn't it be a fun after lunch panel if we weren't talking about data and metrics? So, Keith, you mentioned a lot about when you guys thought about personalization, or what sort of some of the friction points were, that maybe there was this sort of almost red herring effect of, we're going to look only at the near-term metrics, the open rates, we're not going to think more about things like unsubscribes. If you had to think about the handful of metrics that are most important to you in terms of going to your CEO and saying, yeah, we invested in personalization and it's been a success, how do you think about those metrics? What are those metrics that you're thinking about as a media company?
I mean, there are a couple of key, probably the more obvious ones. For us, it's open rates, click-through rates, and then for our TV subscription acquisition campaigns, it's conversions. So I think for us, we focused on really the basics, because I think it's much easier to start with the basic metrics that everyone can wrap their head around than, for us, starting to dive into, which we're doing now, but starting to dive into things like, okay, well, we're asking the sales team to send less sales emails, which ultimately will drive up their rate card, right? But that could take 6 months to see the benefits of that, because, well, if I'm a salesperson, I'm selling a package of 20, I'm going to blow through those in 4 weeks. We'll send one Monday through Friday for 4 straight weeks at this rate card. That's a lot lower rate than you would be able to get if you had a healthier list and be a little bit smarter about who you're targeting. And so I think we really did focus on the very basics. I mean, we looked at open rates, click rates, and conversion rates when it came to an acquisition program or campaign. And it sounds obvious to say, yeah, of course you're going to focus on those, but again, when you're trying to sell it through and trying to convince people to send less, the basics are really the easiest ones for everyone to wrap their heads around. And then you say, look, the open rates went up.
Yep.
So did the clicks, and so did the conversions, and it's like, wow, that's great. So
it sounds like you guys are now also looking at that on a customer level as well, too, though, where you talked about list growth and unsubscribes, and what is the longer term impact of the decisions that you may be making as well.
Yeah, the short term, yeah, right, that's right. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it's, and again, those, the rate card argument, the unsubscribe spam rate argument is one that we make sure is made when we're making these decisions, but you may not see those benefits for half a year. And quite frankly, in our case, for a couple of our lists, we saw the negative impact of sending too much, but 6 months later, and now you're scrambling and saying, holy shit, what do? We have to now scramble to bring the health of that back up. But and then the reverse is true. Say, look, give it 6 months and it'll get healthier. So it'll be a little bit of a waiting game, and you've got to ask people for some patience to see the health of that come back.
Sure. And Tracy, how does that compare to how you guys think about metrics and what numbers you're really looking at to determine the efficacy of the personalization program at JustFab?
Yeah, so we mostly look at lifetime value gross margin, right? So we look at the long-term overview of our customers, and we measure that on a campaign per campaign basis, looking at RPM. So we can test in really small portions and still see, okay, if we had rolled this out to the whole group, how would it have performed, right? So it's a comparison, a fair comparison. We don't really choose between just our personalized emails or just our highly relevant emails versus a batch and blast. If I have a relevant message, if I have a customer who I know has come to our site and is searching for beach vacation wear, and then they put a couple things in their cart and they abandon, I've got something to send them, right? I can send them an email that says, here are the top vacation essentials, here are the 2 things that are left in your cart. If I know that she typically is a 2x the average spend, I can put higher priced items in her cart and not scare her off, right? Or in her email. So we can do a really highly personalized email like that, and it's going to perform very well. Can I do that for everyone that we send to in a given day? No, right? But does that mean that we're not going to send something? No, we're definitely still going to send them something. So we'll have a default batch and blast email that we send as well. So for us, we're not choosing between the revenue you get from the 50,000 personalized emails versus the 1 million that you send out. We do both, and that works very well for us in the end.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, Shar, since you spoke so much about a potential barrier to adoption of personalization being the cost of the tools that are there, naturally, I think what we see a lot of marketers do is build this business case, right, for how you're going to absorb the actual associated costs of doing that. And to do that, you need to have a sense for, well, what are the metrics that are driving the numbers forward? So I guess similar question for you that we asked the customers on stage. What metrics are people looking at across the board to really justify the investment in personalization technology?
So I think the metrics that I see most marketers looking at are very similar to the metrics that were just described. And I usually try to encourage them to look at 2 other dimensions as well. So one, we could call them the additional dimensions value-based metrics and then operational or efficiency-based metrics. So the value-based metrics are looking at what other value do you get out of an email subscriber that might be outside of just the response to the email. Mm-hmm. So that might be something like advocacy. Are they, because they are an email subscriber and they're getting good relevant emails from you, are they in some way giving you something back? They are posting good things about you. They're telling their friends. They're referring new customers. That could also be something like brand recognition. So now you have a better, more aware audience because of this group of customers that you've sent your email to. And then the second dimension that I would recommend thinking about is around efficiency or maybe operational metrics, which are things like, what is the cost savings associated with sending a communication in this way? So you sort of alluded to the cost of bad email, and that's where I would throw this one of, you lose customers if you are messaging them in a bad way. But maybe you're also gaining things like now your team works better together because you have some standard processes in place that is much better at sending out messages more efficiently or in a more triggered way or in a more dynamic response. So what used to take you a week to get out the door now takes you a day. Or maybe you've automated things so you need less headcount. And then the last piece, which I think also fits in that bucket, is around gain in terms of efficiency of conversion. So now maybe your same customer, you would have gotten them over the course of 6 weeks of emailing them, but with a personalized message, you close that conversion faster. So are you shortcutting the cost of sale? So I think that these are all related to the same overall response metrics around opens and clicks, but you're adding on some additional dimensions that indicate improved business value by applying these more advanced efforts.
Sure, and I think that's really interesting because I think if we think about layering kind of the higher level metrics like opens and clicks and conversions with some of the things that you're talking about, that's effectively our recipe for lifetime value, right? When we talk about things like acceleration to first purchase, purchase frequency, so that's really interesting. The opportunity cost point is a really interesting one, because what we see is, inevitably that can actually be a little bit scary sometimes when you hear about that, right? Where you say, well, we've been curating for years, we know this business very well, but what we're seeing very interestingly is that it actually allows teams to focus on cooler stuff, right? Like they get to focus on the strategic and analytical activities that just make coming to work that much more exciting. So it's very interesting. So Keith and Tracy, both of your companies, I think, run great testing-centric cultures. You guys are all about continuous optimization. You spoke about bringing on a dedicated headcount to talk about this. As you guys have run tests around personalization, curious if you can share with us one or two complete surprises that you may have seen along the way in terms of maybe a non-obvious result of some of the efforts that you've launched. You want to kick it off,
Sure,
Tracy?
yeah. I think for me, the most surprising in what we've done when we first tested our happy birthday email, we did a 3-way test with people who had a birthday. We held a true control that didn't receive a birthday message. We had a group that received a message that simply said happy birthday and did not have an offer. And then we had a group that said happy birthday and here's a $10 coupon. Now we all know that the $10 coupon and happy birthday did very well, right? And it did. But what really surprised me is that just by saying happy birthday and not giving them any sort of promotion or anything else related to it, it didn't even have product on it, it was just a cute little email, it's happy birthday and had some balloons on it, we saw a huge lift in sales simply by recognizing that it was our customer's birthday. And that really surprised me.
That's interesting. Yeah. Keith, how about you?
I alluded to it before, but I think one of the pleasant surprises, I think we were hoping it would result in this, was when on a few of our marketing acquisition campaigns targeting new TV subscribers for our direct-to-consumer business, comparing call it a million email blast to a 50,000 email blast where we targeted based on that night's television content and their reading habits, and what number of new subscribers we would get. There was a few campaigns, and anyone wants to ask Chris about these specifically afterwards, they can, because Chris was the guy who came up with the idea to do this, we found that the highly targeted based on what you've read resulted in just as many new subscribers to our television product, or at least relatively close for the the cost and the opportunity cost, than blasting a million people the same message without regard to whether or not they want to get the message or not. So it was really surprising, and we use that. That is a very common tool for us now. We very rarely send out an acquisition email or put together a campaign that is just a complete blast anymore. Once we had a few of those results, it was pretty clear to us that was the way we should be doing it.
Sure. So it's, I think, been super helpful to hear about how your programs have evolved and how they're continuing to evolve. Shar, you mentioned earlier from more of a macro level in the industry, you gave the weather.com example where that's really sort of pushing the line on the prediction side. Wondering if you can expand a little bit on that in terms of how you see predictive technology really taking a front seat role in where personalization is going to continue to go.
Well, I think we're all touching on something which we think is valuable in terms of personalization, but as soon as everybody starts doing it, then you have to look for something else. You have to look for another edge to edge past everyone else who's trying to apply the same thing. And so that's where I think predictive comes into play. I think that I touched this morning on the idea of this more concierge-based approach to marketing, where not only do I get a set of offers that are personalized to my profile, but I get this service element where you are making good on those offers and helping facilitate the experience that I'm in. And I think that's where predictive comes into play. If you can anticipate, based on the journey analysis that you've done of your likely customers, where I am in the journey and what my next need is, and then you facilitate that need, that creates a bond with me that is very difficult to replicate, especially for somebody that hasn't anticipated that next step, that next need.
Sure. And just out of curiosity, you look at personalization in a lot of different industries, right? A lot of what we've spoken about today is really specific to commerce or media. I'm wondering if you see sort of the adoption or the visions, they really differ significantly from vertical to vertical. I think you gave some examples from a lot of different verticals, including financial services. So any interesting trends that you can share on that front?
Well, I would say retail is certainly the leader in this category for the reasons that you might expect, because they are merchants merchandisers. You know, they're good at merchandising product based on certain types of customers, and they are the early adopters of tools that let them map inventory back to customer profiles. So retail, I think, leads, and then everyone else is kind of watching retail and thinking about how that could apply for the industries that they're from too. So then I would say in second place is travel companies for the same reason, because travel companies are also mapping inventory, doing things like personalization of offers, but Delta Airlines, for example, follows the same idea we were talking about with Wells Fargo to personalize the content and functionality on their app based on flight status. So this is not just like, hey, the content based on that I often travel to and from Boston is showing up differently. It's that when my flight status is compromised, there are different buttons on the app that show up that will help me rebook or help me delay my departure. So that level of customization is happening as well. And then I think we get into kind of everybody else, which is financial services, telecoms companies, not a lot of traction around personalization on the B2B side, some CPG companies, but certainly not even fast followers of travel and retail.
Sure, really interesting. So we always like to make sure when we run these panels with customers that the audience can leave with a couple of really actionable insights. So one question I'm going to ask you, Tracy and Keith specifically, is as you look to 2016, what are the programs that your teams are prioritizing to continue the personalization agenda? What's going to be very top of mind as you look to next year? Let's maybe start with Tracy.
Sure. For us, we've really started to get some traction using personalization in email. There's still so much we can do, and it's super exciting. But for us, what's next, I think, is starting to experiment with direct mail, particularly for people who are unsubscribed to receive marketing emails, and also on our site. So I think those are going to be our next big areas of focus.
And Keith, how about at the Blaze?
For us, we're in the process of rebuilding our site with an eye towards, we've had such great success on personalizing your email experience and bringing that type of content to the consumer based on all of their profile information, that the features we are building into our site for our big launch really focus on how to personalize their on-site experience in addition to what they get to us, what they get from us in our email campaign. So, their interaction with the community on our site, as our site, for example, has a very strong community element to it. So we want to foster that with personalization, though. It's not enough to say, let's let them comment. But what happens when they comment? Do they get, do they, kind of go up the rankings of a community member based on great comments or bad comments? They slide down. And then how does that layer into some of the other things that they can do with us as a community? So I think it's looking at what you were talking about, because I do agree that content companies are probably like looking at what, retail companies do to customize and personalize. And then we follow, because it just sort of like that's the industry that does it best. But I think it is really customizing, your experience everywhere based on what you do as an individual and how you interact with the community and our company.
Mm-hmm. Sure, so I'm going to ask the panelists one more question in a second here, but then we actually are going to transition to Q&A. We're going to have a couple people running with mics on the side. So this is your prompt and call to action to start thinking about questions. Final question I have for you guys is a quick one, just in terms of hindsight being 2020. If we had asked you, what's one thing you wish you had known about personalization a couple of years ago that you know now that may be helpful insight for folks in the audience? Would love to hear just initial gut reaction to what that may be. I'll take a volunteer, because I'm putting these guys on the spot a little bit with this one.
I'll go. I would say I wish that I had known the lift in sales revenue I would get from it, because I wouldn't have waited 2 years then to get it live.
Great answer.
I think I think ours is similar, except for us it's, and I think we're still seeing the results of it. I wish we had known and had taken action sooner to fight the ultimate fatigue that happens when you don't personalize. Mm-hmm. Sitting back and not personalizing is not a good strategy, because you will ultimately just abandon those users.
Mm-hmm. And Shar, you're knee deep in this every day. So biggest takeaway or learning over the course of the past few years on this?
Yeah, I think I would say to not it's not that hard to not be afraid to try it. You know, I've found from marketer customers who are even just doing some very basic segmentation, sort of business traveler, leisure traveler type of segmentation, there can be great lift from that. And so I think my lesson is don't overcomplicate it. Just give it a go.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and open up to questions. We have some great people on stage today. I'm sure people are eager to learn a little bit more.
I think personalization is great. I think other companies have done it. Yahoo, I know, I get the Yahoo news at the beginning of my journey online, but I find that there's a bleed between personalization and typecasting. And I find that just because I like the Yankees and the Mets and I like baseball and I like sports, it doesn't mean that every single story that I look at in the morning is about sports. I have, much wider interests than just what I happen to click on that particular day. I think people are much more interested in, they're richer in terms of their varied interests than personalization has been able to identify. So I'd like your thoughts about how you tap into the breadth of people's characters and lifestyles and what they're interested in. Because what I might be interested in today may be something I don't even want to care about another month from now or a year from now. And for the next month, I'm just keep getting those same hits, the same types of data feeds.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Keith, just coming from a media angle?
Yeah, sure. For us, I think when we talk about the automated emails we send in the morning, like the one you get, probably from Yahoo, or your experience in the Yahoo News app, that is, I think that's unavoidable to send you, if we're going to automate it, it's going to be based on how you interact with us. But what we do as a company, and this is where our newsletter managers talk about cool things they can do now that they have more free time because they're not building every single email, is we still believe that, despite all of our user profile information, that because we've been engaged with this audience for, Glenn for 15 years or more, and a lot of the executives for 8 to 10 years or 5 to 8 years, that we still can deliver to you based on what we know about the audience in general, content that you may not get in the morning because you're not reading every article that might in an automated way send it to you first thing. So I think we have to interject our own manual decision making sometimes where we say let's send a great email in the morning or on a weekend, like we have a faith-based email. We just know that our audience likes faith-based topics, regardless of whether or not you're reading them. You'll tell us if you don't by telling us, I'm going to unsubscribe to the Saturday morning faith-based email. So we interject logic and just common sense and send out some emails like Tracy was saying, regardless of what your user profile tells us, because we kind of do know who you are because we've been engaged with you for 10 to 15 years as a group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting answer. I think more generally, just speaking anecdotally around what we've seen other customers do on this end, I think it's, we'll push them in the automation direction with it, right? But it's how do you work in things like what's most popular, right? In addition to the stuff that may be really targeted based on your specific customer profile, and it rounds that out pretty nicely. But I think it is an interesting conundrum that a lot of marketers find themselves in.
Yeah, like robots are not going to replace humans completely in this space, at least not for us on the content side.
But and I think what you're describing, I wouldn't refer to as personalization, right? I think that's kind of what in the 90s and early 2000s we attempted for personalization to be, by some demographics from a database that tell you that, I'm a female and I'm 38 years old, and so then let's assume that I'm interested in Botox, right? But maybe I'm not, right? So I think the way that we do personalization now is more individualized. Individualization, I think, is a great way to describe it, right? So if you see that I'm constantly clicking on fashion articles and I'm never clicking on Botox articles, well, maybe I'm more interested in reading about fashion, and that's what you can serve up to me as an individual, which has nothing to do with the fact that I'm female and I'm 38 and I live in LA, right? So I think that the way that it's done now is more of an individual and less of a segmentation basis. We're not making assumptions that because of your demographics and psychographics that you must be interested in sports because you're male. We're saying, well, because you've clicked on a lot of sports articles, that's why you're interested, and that's why we're serving that up.
I had just a specific response to you. I was reading some of our research prior to the panel, and a colleague of mine actually profiled the type of data that he says is needed to create a really individualized profile. And so I'll just give you these data attributes so that you can think about them. So there's profile data, which is disclosed data about yourself. I'm saying I'm a female and this is where, and I'm 38 and I live in LA. Then there's affinity data, which could be inferred or observed based on things that I always like. These are not necessarily things I'm in the market for. They are things that are constant about me. I always like dogs, whether I own a dog right now or not. And I am posting about that. I'm liking things that have to do with those interests. Then there's sentiment data. This is about what is happening for me right now. I'm expressing myself. I'm stressed. I'm tired. I'm happy. I'm sad. I'm congratulatory, whatever those are. Then there's behavioral data. This is very familiar and a place that lots of marketers go right now. Then there's content that I create about myself. And then there's context, which is the situational information that I'm in right now. And so I think that's very good, because I think a lot of what you're describing might be in part because of an incomplete profile. You know, incomplete, you've got pieces of that, but maybe you're missing some of the other pieces which show the dimensionality of what we all are as very complicated and interesting creatures.
I think that's really interesting. I was actually at another event last week, and they were talking a lot about customer data, right? And there was sort of 3 buckets that are loosely in line with what you just said, where there's configured customer data, right, where the customer is actually going and configuring what those settings are. Then there's the acquired, right, which is through the, oh, we're working with a vendor like Jan Rain, and we're taking in those social profiles. And then there's the inferred, right? And I think the inferred goes back to a lot of things that you were talking about, Tracy, right? And that's really sort of the next wave of what we're going to be seeing here. We probably have time for one more question, if anyone out there. Okay, we have someone. Yep.
Thanks. Just a quick question. This is for Shar. Do you have any good examples for contextualization specifically?
For contextualization within email?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the best examples today are some of the open time personalization examples. So things that are pulling in things like mapping or location data. Retailers are doing this. The example I'm thinking of is from AMIA, the Canadian Rewards loyalty program, where they send out emails with a map that changes based on where you are when you open the email, that gives you location information of where you can redeem your awards. So things like location, Jaguar has been doing something similar, pulling in social media posts. So somebody buys a new car, they post a picture of them or their partner in their car, and then they post that, Jaguar pulls that and sends it out in an email. So very contextual. It's about something that's happening in the moment, in the situation, or location specific, being sent out through an email to help create relevance.
Great. Well, first I want to give a round of applause to our panelists. Really appreciate their involvement and sharing their insights today.